June 1944. Saipan. The jungle steam hangs thick over a shattered ridge as the gunfire finally fades into a dull, distant echo. A young Japanese soldier lies motionless in the dirt, half buried beneath splintered bamboo, convinced his final moment has arrived. He hears boots approaching, heavy, foreign, unmistakably American. He waits for the steel of a bayonet. Instead, a hand touches his shoulder, not to end his life, but to save it. A U.S. medic kneels beside him, opening his field kit, and this is where the story truly begins. The Pacific War was already defined by a brutal truth. Neither side expected mercy. Between 1942 and 1944, the fighting from New Guinea to the Central Pacific took on a character unlike any other theater of the Second World War. The Imperial Japanese Army fought under a code shaped by Bushido, one that framed surrender not merely as weakness, but as dishonor worse than death. For many soldiers raised in this culture, being taken alive by the enemy was unthinkable. Their officers warned them that Americans tortured captives, mutilated bodies, and used prisoners for target practice. These stories were not rare. They were repeated in training camps, reinforced aboard troop ships, and echoed in the caves and bunkers of every island fortress. American troops carried their own fears. They had faced suicide charges on Guadalcanal, seen comrades bayoneted at night on New Georgia, and discovered booby-trapped bodies on Bougainville. They had learned that approaching a wounded Japanese soldier could mean triggering a grenade hidden beneath a jacket or stepping into the sightline of a concealed sniper. In this environment, hesitation could be fatal. Many U.S. infantrymen emerged from earlier battles convinced that the enemy would fight to the last breath, an impression strengthened by the near absence of Japanese prisoners. By late 1943, fewer than a handful of captured Japanese soldiers had been taken alive in several major battles. Most chose death. Some pretended to surrender only to detonate explosives. Others charged medics attempting to help them. The war hardened both sides, pushing them into a cycle where every encounter seemed to confirm the worst assumptions. Yet the United States military, bound by the Geneva Convention and guided by a long tradition of battlefield medical ethics, maintained a simple rule. A wounded man was a wounded man, enemy or not. Field medics were instructed to render aid whenever possible once an area was secure. Not every battle allowed this, and not all soldiers followed it, but many did, and in the later campaigns of 1944, these rare moments of humanity began to break through the fog of myth that surrounded the enemy. It was on islands like Saipan, Guam, and Peleliu that Japanese soldiers first confronted something their training had never prepared them for: Americans who saved enemy wounded instead of killing them. By mid-1944, the United States had pushed deep into the Central Pacific. The Marianas became the next major objective, a chain of islands whose capture would place American bombers within reach of the Japanese home islands. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were defended by hardened Japanese garrisons, men who fully expected to die rather than surrender. Military planners in Tokyo had no illusions. They assumed no significant number of their troops would return alive. Orders emphasized defense to the last man, and officers reminded their soldiers that capture by Americans meant suffering worse than death. But even before the battles began, American medical doctrine stood in stark contrast to this worldview. U.S. field manuals clearly outlined obligations toward enemy wounded. Once an area was secure, medics were to provide first aid without discrimination. This principle had existed since World War I and was reaffirmed throughout the interwar years. The Geneva Convention reinforced it, but for many medics, it went beyond legal duty. It was a deeply ingrained moral code. These were men trained to stabilize any injured human they found, regardless of uniform or language. When the assault waves hit the beaches of Saipan in June 1944, this clash of belief systems crept into every corner of the fighting. American forces encountered Japanese wounded who begged to be killed rather than captured, others who attempted to crawl away to die privately, and some who reached for grenades the moment a U.S. medic approached. Yet after each engagement, when the noise of battle died down, medics moved through the shattered cane fields and coral ridges, searching for survivors. They bandaged American Marines and soldiers first, but they did not stop there. Reports from the 2nd Marine Division, the 27th Infantry Division, and naval medical units all recorded similar scenes. Gravely wounded Japanese soldiers, stunned to find themselves lifted onto American stretchers, carried to aid stations, and treated alongside U.S. wounded. Some cried in disbelief. Others remained silent, unable to reconcile what they saw with what they had been told. These moments did not change the brutal course of the Pacific War, but they created small fractures in the ideological walls that separated both sides. And it was inside these fractures that a powerful story took shape. A story of shock, humanity, and unexpected mercy. For a Japanese infantryman raised under the Imperial Army's code, the moment of capture was supposed to be a moment of terror. He had been told that Americans mutilated prisoners and left the wounded to die slowly on the battlefield. So when he lay bleeding on Saipan's shattered terrain, thirst burning his throat, dust clogging his lungs, the sound of American boots sent a surge of dread through him. He expected the end. Instead, he felt a canteen pressed to his lips. He watched a medic kneel beside him, slipping open a canvas pouch, not to expose a knife, but to bind his wounds. His fear did not vanish at once, but confusion began to overpower it, creating the first cracks in a belief system built over years of training. The medic who knelt in front of him had no illusions about the danger. He had already seen wounded Japanese soldiers clutch grenades under their bodies, hoping to kill rescuer and rescued alike. He knew snipers sometimes targeted medics specifically, recognizing the Red Cross as a threat to their defensive lines. Still, his training remained clear: stabilize the wounded, regardless of nationality, once the area was secure. For him, the battlefield was not a place to judge who deserved to live. It was a place to prevent death wherever possible. His hands moved automatically, cutting a tunic open, cleaning the wound, checking the pulse. He worked quickly, not because the man was an enemy, but because he was dying. Nearby Japanese prisoners watched, their expressions a mix of disbelief and unease. They had been prepared for torture, not rescue. Across from them, American infantrymen also observed the scene. Some had lost close friends earlier that same day. Others had carried the memory of bonsai charges that nearly overran their lines. Seeing the medic at work pulled the fight into human focus. It was a reminder, even in a war without mercy, that the enemy was made not of propaganda, but of men. And these human encounters set the stage for deeper cultural and moral collisions ahead. Treating enemy wounded in the Pacific was never a simple humanitarian decision. It carried immediate tactical danger. Cave defenses on Saipan, Guam, and Peleliu often concealed pockets of Japanese soldiers still willing to fight, even after their positions had been overwhelmed. American patrols approaching a wounded man had to assume the worst. He might be armed, he might be bait. He might be waiting for the moment a medic leaned in. Some Marines recalled cases where wounded Japanese feigned unconsciousness, only to detonate grenades. Yet even with this history, medics stepped forward once the firing ceased. Their courage was not only physical, it was moral. They risked their lives to uphold a principle that many enemy soldiers had been taught did not exist. To Japanese soldiers, the American willingness to save wounded enemies was almost incomprehensible. Their own military code stressed that a soldier should die before becoming a burden. Wounded men often crawled into caves to perish quietly. Aid stations were sparse, and evacuation under fire was rarely prioritized. In contrast, American doctrine emphasized aggressive battlefield medicine, rapid evacuation, triage, and stabilization. When Japanese prisoners saw their wounded placed on stretchers and carried back, sometimes by the very troops they had fought moments earlier, it challenged the core of their wartime indoctrination. The concept that an enemy could value their life was something many had never been allowed to imagine. These moments of mercy created lasting impressions. Several Japanese veterans later wrote that their first moment of doubt about wartime propaganda came not after surrender, but when they saw a U.S. medic place a bandage on a wounded comrade. Some described it as the first time they felt the war's ideological distance begin to crack. On the American side, soldiers witnessing these rescues reported a temporary shift in perspective. Seeing an enemy trembling on a stretcher, stripped of weapons and fearsome myths, reminded them that every uniform hid a human story. These converging angles now lead toward a single moment, a turning point where belief, fear, and battlefield reality collided in one decisive encounter. By the summer of 1944, the battle for Saipan had reached one of its most violent phases. The American advance pressed steadily northward, forcing the surviving Japanese defenders into a shrinking pocket of caves and shattered ridgelines. Mortar smoke drifted through the valleys, mixing with the scent of burned vegetation. Every ridge seemed alive with echoes, sporadic rifle cracks, the thump of grenades, the distant rumble of artillery pounding the last organized defensive lines. On one hillside near Mount Tapochau, a Japanese platoon had been nearly annihilated by a combined assault of Marine infantry and supporting tanks. The bombardment left only a handful of survivors scattered among the rocks and fallen trees. Some lay silent, others moaned softly, trying not to draw attention. Beneath them, the coral earth was stained dark with hours-old blood. As American infantry swept forward to secure the ridge, they moved cautiously. The Marines had learned through bitter experience that a quiet battlefield did not guarantee safety. A wounded soldier might still be clutching a grenade. A cave opening that seemed empty could hide a sniper waiting for a single exposed target. Every movement was measured. Every breath was deliberate. When the shooting finally stopped, a medic from the 4th Marine Division was called forward. He crossed the ridge slowly, stepping between broken helmets and twisted equipment. His job was familiar. Check the wounded Americans first, then search for any signs of life among the enemy. Behind him moved 2 riflemen, weapons lowered but ready. He soon reached a Japanese private lying against a splintered tree trunk. Dirt clung to the man's face. His uniform was torn open at the shoulder. His breaths were short, almost silent. The Marine medic knelt. The Japanese soldier's eyes widened in terror, expecting the cold finality of a rifle muzzle. He tried to raise an arm, but the pain forced him back. Instead of a weapon, the medic drew a pair of scissors and began cutting away the blood-soaked fabric around the wound. The watching Japanese survivors, hidden among the rocks, could scarcely comprehend the sight. This enemy, this man they had been told would butcher them, was gently checking the wounded soldier's pulse. He asked for a stretcher. He reached for morphine. And in that fragile, breathless moment on the ridge, the Pacific War's harshest assumptions collided with a reality no one on the Japanese side had expected. The medic worked quickly, knowing the ridge was still dangerous. His hands moved with a steady rhythm. Cut, clean, bandage, secure. The Japanese soldier flinched once as antiseptic touched torn flesh, but the medic's voice remained low and even. He did not speak Japanese. The wounded man did not speak English. Yet the slow, careful movements carried a message that required no translation. 2 Marines unfolded a stretcher. As they lifted the injured man, a faint panic flickered across his face. He had been taught that enemy capture meant humiliation, torture, or slow death. But when the medic adjusted the blanket around his chest and checked his breathing again, fear mixed with confusion. No one struck him, no one shouted, no bayonet was waiting for him. Just beyond the ridge, in a narrow patch of brush, 2 other wounded Japanese soldiers watched the scene through trembling eyelids. They had survived the bombardment, but expected nothing more than a lonely end. Now, seeing Americans carry their comrade with deliberate care, they exchanged stunned glances. One whispered shakily, unsure if his own eyes were betraying him. At the base of the ridge, the stretcher team reached an improvised aid station. Here, American and Japanese wounded lay only a few feet apart, separated by language and uniforms, but united by injury, exhaustion, and the simple human need for help. A Navy corpsman checked the Japanese private's pulse again, inserted plasma tubing, and stabilized his breathing. The man tried to speak once, but the corpsman shook his head gently, signaling that he should save his strength. Nearby prisoners watched everything with a mixture of disbelief and quiet awe. One of them later recalled in post-war testimony that this moment was the first time he realized everything he had been told about American cruelty was false. He had expected brutality. Instead, he saw discipline and professionalism. Another survivor remembered feeling a sudden sense of disorientation, as if the world he understood had been turned upside down. For the Americans present, the moment carried its own weight. Some Marines stared openly, grappling with the contrast between the enemy who had fought ferociously minutes before and the frail, wounded man now lying helpless under their care. The medic himself later explained in an interview that, to him it was simple. A wounded man is just a wounded man. On that ridge above Saipan, war did not cease. The island remained a battlefield, but for a brief, irreplaceable moment, the logic of total war bent under the quiet force of humanity. And from that moment grew consequences neither side would forget. In the days that followed the fighting on Saipan, the scale of the human cost became clearer. American forces counted more than 13,000 casualties. The Japanese garrison, over 30,000 strong, had been almost entirely destroyed. Yet amid the devastation, American medical units recorded something unusual. Hundreds of Japanese wounded treated, stabilized, or evacuated to rear area hospitals. It was a small number compared to the tens of thousands who died, but it represented one of the first significant waves of living Japanese prisoners of war in the Central Pacific Campaign. Official reports described how field hospitals established separate wards for enemy wounded, staffed by doctors and nurses who were expected to treat them under the same medical standards applied to Americans. Many wounded Japanese arrived terrified, bracing for cruelty they had been assured was inevitable. Instead, they received food, water, dressings, and surgery when needed. Some tried to refuse care, believing that living as a prisoner would bring shame upon their families. Others quietly accepted it, too exhausted to resist. For U.S. personnel, the work was a practical matter. Saving wounded prisoners meant gaining intelligence, maps, unit designations, defensive layouts, even personal letters that shed light on Japanese morale. But beyond tactical benefit, there was a deeper conviction. A wounded soldier, regardless of his uniform, was no longer a combatant. He was a patient. Not every American soldier embraced this perspective. Some frontline Marines, still bitter from the loss of friends in Banzai attacks, struggled with the idea of offering aid to men who had fought with such ferocity. But the medics rarely hesitated. Their calling demanded a kind of moral consistency that battlefield anger could not easily shake. As word of these rescues spread among surviving prisoners, a shift occurred, subtle but real. Some Japanese soldiers, who had expected execution upon surrender, now realized that capture might mean survival. And survival, in a war where death had been framed as the only honorable path, changed everything. This transformation set the stage for the personal testimonies and post-war reflections that followed. In the months after Saipan fell, the impact of these unexpected acts of mercy slowly emerged through scattered testimonies from surviving Japanese soldiers. Many of them spent the remainder of the war in American POW camps, first on Guam or Hawaii, later on the U.S. mainland. There, under guarded conditions, they received medical care, regular meals, and treatment that contradicted every warning they had heard before deployment. Some prisoners later wrote that their greatest shock was not capture itself, but the moment they realized their lives still held value in the eyes of their captors. American camp reports noted that once the fear of mistreatment faded, many Japanese prisoners became cooperative. They shared information about their units, not out of coercion, but out of confusion, trying to understand why they had been spared at all. A few asked medics directly, through interpreters, why the Americans had helped them. The answer was always the same: "You are wounded. It is our duty." These interactions formed the earliest seeds of a remarkable post-war transformation. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, some former prisoners returned home carrying memories that challenged the wartime propaganda they had once believed. A handful of them later spoke publicly, explaining how, In the midst of a brutal conflict, American soldiers had treated them with dignity when they had expected death. Their accounts, though not widespread at first, added nuance to Japan's evolving understanding of the Allied enemy. For the American medics who served in the Pacific, these rescues remain some of their clearest memories. Decades later, veterans would recall the faces of wounded Japanese soldiers they treated, faces filled with terror, disbelief, and finally relief. Many medics insisted they had done nothing extraordinary. They simply followed their training and preserved life when they could. Yet, in the broader story of the Pacific War, a campaign defined by ferocity, cultural barriers, and mutual fear, these small, quiet acts of compassion stood out sharply against the overwhelming backdrop of violence. And it is from these rare acts that a larger reflection emerges, one that speaks to the deeper human truths buried within even the harshest conflicts. In a war remembered for its unforgiving brutality, the moments when U.S. troops saved wounded Japanese soldiers remain among the most striking reminders of humanity's resilience. They did not change the trajectory of the Pacific campaign. They did not soften the ferocity of battles still to come. But they revealed something essential. Even in the most hostile conditions, the instinct to preserve life can rise above fear, hatred, and years of relentless indoctrination. For the Japanese soldiers who survived because an American medic intervened, these memories often stayed with them long after the war ended. They became proof that the enemy they had been taught to fear was made of men no different from themselves. Men capable of cruelty, yes, but also capable of mercy. For the medics who knelt on coral ridges and in smoke-filled valleys, the decision to treat wounded enemies was never about ideology. It was about honoring a duty that transcended the battlefield. History tends to remember the Pacific War through images of fire, steel, and relentless sacrifice. Yet within that vast landscape of destruction, these brief acts of compassion shine with a rare clarity. They remind us that even in humanity's darkest hours, the choice to save a life can become its own quiet form of victory.